Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce my very good friend and collaborator, Ray Kurzweil. The short form of his biography is in your materials, but I think what might be more meaningful to you is for me to share more of a personal introduction. Ray and I recently realized that there are probably no two people that either of us know, and we're both fortunate to know hundreds of people, who have a higher correlation of interests, who have more interests in common with each other than the two of us have with each other. And that certainly makes my life very enjoyable, and I know it adds enjoyment to Ray's life as well. Just to give you a short summary, Ray is leading our research effort into a new type of cancer stem cell that is being done at MIT that, if successful, could result in a blockbuster cure for cancer, something that Barack Obama mentioned in his speech last night. Ray helped redesign our telecardiology algorithm that we use to monitor patients' P waves, QRS intervals throughout the country and help prevent heart attacks. He and his team, using their pattern recognition expertise, helped us re-engineer that algorithm, and it's now being used by thousands of people throughout the country. He's on the board of directors of Unither Therapeutics, so has helped us identify the best areas of activity. And I've also been very pleased to collaborate with him in the nutritional supplement area and even areas outside the immediate purview of technology. We are collaborators on a film version of his best-selling book, The Singularity is Near, that should be ready for release either toward the end of this year or thereabouts. And so we just have a tremendously wide range of activity. I really believe that his books are among the most prophetic in the best sense of the word, meaning a true vision of the near-term future that have ever been written by anybody. And Ray usually speaks to groups of hundreds and even thousands of people. So it's a really rare treat to have a private lecture by Ray to a group as small as this. And just heart goes out to you, little brothers. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for that warm introduction. This has been a very gratifying friendship and relationship, multifaceted one, a personal relationship, and we have worked together, as Martine indicated, on many different projects. I'll tell you a little bit more about the cancer project. I've had the privilege of serving on the Unither Therapeutics board since it went public. That is actually a very unique company. It's the only biotechnology company I know that goes completely from basic scientific research to being a commercial success. Most biotech companies de-risk a project, take it up to in vitro tests, maybe animal tests, maybe they go to phase 1. But Unither Therapeutics is the leader in pulmonary hypertension treatments, having gone from basic science to a high level of ongoing commercial success, and it's now researching and developing drugs in many different areas, including cancer, as Martine mentioned. Unither Therapeutics exists in an alternative universe. It's a universe that doesn't have recessions, doesn't have stock market crashes, and it has relatively few, there are no failures. Failure is just success deferred, because Martine shares my philosophy that when you meet challenges, you just go around them, and ultimately you get there. Edison could have stopped when he was advised to after 1,000 filaments didn't work. So it's been a great privilege to work with you, and I look forward to many other collaborations. And biotechnology, by the way, is the foundation of what we're talking about today, because as you can see from the presentations, nanotechnology can only be done with a basic understanding of biology. And most of the presentations have been very intensive in terms of understanding the mechanisms of biology and how we can then go beyond them by extending them with our technology. And that's what human beings do. We go beyond our limitations. We didn't stay in the ground. We didn't stay on the planet. We have not stayed with the limitations of our biology. Very few of us would be here. I see a few young faces, but life expectancy was 23 1,000 years ago. So without the technological progress we've made, at best we'd all be senior citizens. And this is going to go into high gear. I want to talk about exponential growth. That's a key theme. And the reason that my projections sometimes seem daunting or radical to some observers is that they leave out the exponential nature of progress in information technology. And there's a good reason for that. Our intelligence is designed to make predictions. That's what intelligence does. And when we walked through the savannah 1,000 years ago, we saw something coming at us through the corner of our eye. We made a linear prediction about where that animal would be and what to do about it, and that worked quite well 1,000 years ago. And we have built-in predictors that are linear. That's our intuition. But our intuition is wrong when it comes to the progress of evolutionary processes. And I'll show you this applies both to biological evolution and technological evolution. And in fact, technological evolution emerges smoothly out of the biological evolution that led to the technology creating species. And that progresses in an exponential manner. And we can actually measure that. And it turns out if we can measure the underlying information properties of a technology, it progresses in an exponential manner. Depending on what we're measuring, the doubling time might be 2 years, 1 year, 15 months, 9 months, but there's an exponential progression. And that is not intuitive. So when people look out, they make linear predictions about where technology will be. And if I take 30 steps linearly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I get to 30. If I take 30 steps exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, I get to 1 billion. It makes a huge difference. And this is not just a projection. I've been doing this for 30 years. I decided I would be an inventor when I was 5. 30 years ago, I realized the key to being successful as an inventor was timing. Most inventors fail not because they can't get their gadgets to work, but because the timing is wrong, the enabling factors aren't in place when they need to be. And we do some mentoring and early stage investing, and we get a lot of business plans. And I would say 90% of those teams would build exactly what they claim if given the resources, but 90% of those projects would still fail because the timing is wrong. And being an engineer, I started gathering a lot of data. This has taken on a life of its own. I now have a team of 10 people that gathers data in different areas where we can measure the information properties. And 30 years ago, I started to make mathematical models of how technology progresses in different areas. And really, to my surprise, I saw that it really follows extremely predictable trajectories. And the common wisdom is you can't predict the future. And that's true for specific projects, specific companies. There's one exception to that, which is United Therapeutics. But otherwise, you really don't know who's going to succeed or fail. Will Google's stock be higher or lower than it is today? That's hard to predict. But if you ask me, what will the cost of a MIPS of computing be in 2012, or the cost of sequencing a base pair of DNA in 2014, or the cost of a megabyte of brain data, or the spatial resolution of brain scanning in 2016, I can give you a figure, and it's likely to be accurate because my predictions have been accurate for quite a long time. In the early 80s, I saw the DARPA net doubling every year. It was only a few tens of thousands of nodes, so I predicted a World Wide Web connecting hundreds of millions of people emerging in the mid-1990s, and that was seen as ridiculous and was heavily criticized when the entire DoD budget could only fund a few thousand scientists on the DARPA net, but it came to pass right on schedule. I saw the chess supercomputers doubling in power every year, and that put the crossover where a computer would beat the world chess champion in 1998, and that was scoffed at in early 80s when the average chess player could beat the best machines, and Kasparov scoffed at it in 93 when he said, I've played the best chess machines in the world, and they're pathetic, brittle, predictable, but they soared past them in 97. And the Genome Project was controversial when it was announced in 1990, because mainstream scientists said we used our best equipment, our most advanced graduate students, and around the world we collected 1/10,000th of the genome. This is going to take centuries. And halfway through the project, the skeptics were confirmed, saying, I told you this wasn't going to work. I mean, here you are halfway through a 15-year project, and you finish 1% of the project. But that's right on schedule for an exponential progression, because you start out doubling little numbers, which might actually be sublinear. And if you double 1% 7 more times, you get 100%, and that's exactly what happened, and that's continued past the end of the Genome Project. So those of you who've read my book, Singularities Near, you see I have numerous graphs in different areas of technology where you can measure the information properties. They follow amazingly predictable exponential progressions. I wanted to update them for this presentation, so you will see presentation graphs now that are updated to 2007. Singularities Near is a 2005 book. The graphs are up through 2002. So we recently updated them to 2007. My staff asked me, aren't you a little nervous? I mean, maybe it didn't follow the graphs. It's not like we control this, and it's not a tabletop physics experiment. And I said, well, you know, maybe it won't come out right, but that'll probably reflect the problem with the data, not the actual progressions. But they came out right on the progression. It really never ceases to amaze me how predictable this is when these graphs are a measure of the innovation and the invention of millions of people, like all of you in this room, around the world, and they follow these amazingly predictable projections. Except that a lot of your presentations this morning, you're making progress faster than my predictions. My prediction is on size reduction, a factor of 100 in 3D volume. That's about 4.5 in linear dimensions per decade. And a lot of you, if you compare the presentations today to the ones a year ago, are faster than that. So slow down. I like to keep my graphs neat. It's hard to explain if we go off the graph, even if it's in a good direction. So we have time. It's very exciting to see the progress on the respirosites. I'll show you a brief video of that, but I've been talking about that for a long time and have funded some of our predecessors' work, and it's exciting to see that let's actually make progress on that. I don't have quite $1 quadrillion. I could give you half down. It's a down payment. Well, obviously, we need to make exponential progress, but that's exactly what we will do. So one of my main themes is that progress in information technology is exponential, and it's predictable. And moreover, it's not just Moore's law. People often call this Moore's law, and they say, well, how long will Moore's law last? Moore's law is just one example. It's just one paradigm, even within computation. It was not the first paradigm to bring exponential growth to computation. The exponential growth of computation started, I have data back to the 1890 American census, decades before Gordon Moore was even born. And it's very smooth, doubly exponential growth. Moore's law, the shrinking of component sizes on an integrated circuit, was the fifth, not the first paradigm to bring exponential growth to computing. And what happened, people say, well, you can't just take these exponentials and project them out indefinitely. Exponential growth comes to an end. You get 2 rabbits in Australia, and you get 4, 8, 16 rabbits, but finally they eat up all the foliage and the exponential growth stops. And indeed, all of these exponentials run out of resources. But what happens is as we see the end of the road for a particular paradigm, it creates research pressure to create the next paradigm. And the next paradigm is there generally in time. Sometimes if you have enough data, you can actually see a little ripple as the cascade of S-curves that makes up the exponential can be seen on these graphs. But this has actually happened now 5 times in computation. The first predictions for the end of Moore's law were 2002. Gordon Moore now says 2022. If you talk to Justin Ratner, who's the chief technology officer at Intel, he will tell you they already have the 6th paradigm working in their laboratories, which is 3-dimensional molecular self-organizing circuits. Those self-organizing electronic circuits will be part of nanobots to provide the computational resources that are needed, and they have early prototypes of these kinds of circuits working, and they're already actually, look at your cell phone, it has some early harbingers of three-dimensional circuits working in there. But it's not just computation that is subject to this, what I call law of accelerating returns. It's any technology where we can measure the information properties. And industries go, and areas of science and technology go through a transformation from a pre-information era to a post-information era. Now, health and medicine was not an information technology up until very recently. We didn't have the genome until 2003, and we didn't have means of manipulating it, and we couldn't simulate biological processes, et cetera. Now, we made progress. Life expectancy was 23 1,000 years ago. It's 37 in 1800. There was no sanitation, no antibiotics. We didn't understand the germ theory of disease. Mozart and Schubert died in their 30s, and that was typical. So it was 48 in 1900. We've made progress, but that's been linear progress. Health and medicine has been hit or miss. We would just find something. Oh, here's something that lowers blood pressure. We don't really know why it works. There's no really good theory of operation. We can't design or simulate these drugs. Most of the drugs on the market today were done that way. It's called drug discovery, discovering something that happens. Like Viagra was a blood pressure medication. They asked people to send them back, and all the women sent them back. The men didn't send them back. They looked into why that was, and they made an accidental discovery. That's how drug development has been done. Now we have some new set of tools. We collected the genome, which, as I said, was a beautiful example of the law of accelerating returns. I'll show you how exquisitely smooth and predictable that progression has been in terms of the amount of genetic data we've collected, the cost of that genetic data, and this is also now true of other aspects of reverse engineering biology, like the proteome project, the connectome project to understand the human brain, and so on. We also have means now of actually changing what amounts to outdated software in our bodies. I mean, when's the last time you updated your software on your notebook or your phone? It's probably a few weeks ago. In fact, your phone now updates its software automatically without you even knowing it. We still have software running in our bodies. That's what our genes are. They are data programs. Okay, they don't work exactly like the sequential linear software on our PCs. They have three-dimensional properties. They interact with the three-dimensional properties of proteins, but they are linear sequences that give rise to linear sequences of amino acids that fold up in a predictable way, and we have, in fact, made progress on protein folding, at least in simulation. We can now actually simulate at least short sequences of amino acids and predict how they will fold up, and that's been a recent development on the latest supercomputers. But the software is outdated. It evolved thousands of years ago. The fat insulin receptor gene says, hold on to every calorie because the next hunting season may not work out so well. That made sense when that gene evolved. Actually, it's a very ancient gene that allows animals to roam around. Plants don't have a fat insulin receptor gene. But that, in today's world, which in most parts of the world are an era of abundance rather than scarcity, it's led to an epidemic of obesity. We'd like to turn that off, at least in the fat cells. You can't turn them off in the muscle cells. That would lead to a muscle wasting disease. We have a technology now, RNA interference, that can turn genes off. The fat insulin receptor gene was turned off in mice at the Johnson Diabetes Center. These animals ate ravenously and remained slim, and it wasn't a fake slimness. They didn't get diabetes, they didn't get heart disease. They lived 20% longer. They got most of the benefit of caloric restriction while doing the opposite. There are several pharmaceutical companies rushing to bring that idea to the human market. That's just one of the 23,000 genes we'd like to consider tinkering with. And RNA interference just started working a few years ago. It's another one of the prerequisites that has now made health and medicine an information technology. And as an example of the acceleration of progress, it was recognized with the Nobel Prize within a few years of it being shown to work. Usually in times past, that would take 20 years. Now it took 3 or 4 years. We have new means of gene therapy. They can add new genes. So one of the pioneering projects at United Therapeutics is to take cells out of the body, in this case lung cells, add a new gene in vitro. Now you can expect that it got done correctly, that there aren't other troublesome genetic errors. It doesn't trigger the immune system since you're doing it in vitro. That's been an issue that has plagued gene therapy in the past. Then that cell is replicated, and so it's inspected with a new type of microscope. That's another new development. It's replicated a millionfold. It's another new technology. Injected back in the body, they're lung cells, so they end up back in the lungs. And this has cured pulmonary hypertension in animals. It's undergoing human trials. It's one example of many. There are about 1,000 drugs or processes in the development and testing pipeline using either RNA interference or new forms of gene therapy to basically update the outdated software that runs in our bodies. And the other development is that we can now design these interventions on computers in many cases, and we can simulate them on increasingly sophisticated biological simulators. Now, all of these things are in an early stage of development. But now that this type of development, and this is the basis of biotechnology and nanotechnology, is an information technology, it will grow at an exponential rate, roughly doubling in power every year. That means that these technologies will be 1,000 times more powerful in a decade, 1,000,000 times more powerful in 20 years. And the progress will be a lot faster than people think it will be, because they're looking to the past as a guidance for what progress will be. But the past is not, health and medicine was not an information technology. It progressed at a linear pace. And exponential progress is very surprising. When I was a student at MIT, we all shared one computer. It took up a whole building. The computer on your cell phone today is 1,000,000 times smaller, 1,000,000 times cheaper, and 1,000 times more powerful. So that's not the future. That's the past. That's a billion-fold increase in price performance that we've seen since I was a student, which was a few years ago. And we're going to do it again. The rate of progress is actually a double exponential. It's a slow second level of exponential growth. So we'll make another billion-fold increase in price performance and computation, as powerful and as influential as computers are already in the next 25 years. And what used to fit in a building now fits in your pocket. What fits in your pocket today will fit in a blood cell at that rate in 25 years. And so the experiments that are being discussed at this conference are very exciting in terms of what can be done today. So take what we can do today. There's already a wide variety of experiments in vitro and some in animals. One scientist cured type 1 diabetes with a blood cell-sized device that's nano-engineered with 7-nanometer pores that protects pancreatic islet cells. So the pores are too small for the macrophages to get in and destroy it, because type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder. But they're big enough for the insulin to get out and for the nutrients to get in to feed the cell. And this is actually cured type 1 diabetes in test animals. They are gearing up for human trials on something comparable. At MIT, they have a blood cell-sized device that can detect cancer cells based on the antigens on their surface, although I think actually they're targeting the wrong antigens, but the principle is good, and then destroys the cell. So these are early experiments. Or take a computer that you can put in your brain today. It's not blood cell size yet, it's pea size. But it can replace some of the functionality of the neurons destroyed by Parkinson's disease. And the latest generation of this pea-sized neural implant, which is an FDA-approved therapy, allows you to download new software to the computer inside your brain from outside the patient. So take what we can do today and apply 100,000-fold shrinking in size over the next 25 years based on my models. But if we were to take this conference, which is probably ahead of the curve, probably not typical of the average, but it would be even faster. But just take my models. They'll be 100,000 times smaller, a billion times greater in price performance in 25 years, and you get some idea of what will be feasible. And I've always used my models primarily to time my own technology projects. So I'll show you one example of that. This is one of my first inventions, a reading machine for the blind. It was the first CCD flatbed scanner, Omnifont OCR and text-to-speech synthesis, and it could read out loud to the blind. You can't see the scale, but it's about the size of a washing machine, and it was quite expensive. So in 2000, and so they got smaller over the years. I've stayed involved with this field for 35 years. And in 2002, it was a device that sat on your desk. So it wasn't exactly portable, but it wasn't as cumbersome as this. And since I gave presentations at technology disabilities conferences, I would make the prediction someday a blind person will be able to take a device out of their pocket and just snap a picture and read the print as they go through the day and not have to bring it back to their desk, which would include material you can't bring back to your desk, like a sign on a wall, the bank ATM display. You can bring the menu from a restaurant back to your desk, but you'd rather read it in the restaurant. And so in 2002, Dr. Maurer, the president of the National Federation of the Blind, who had worked with me on this device, said, well, Ray, you've been making this prediction for many years now. When is this going to be feasible? And I said, well, according to our models of cell phone technology, portable digital cameras, portable computing, we'll have the requisite computation and photo resolution and a digital camera available in 6 years, in 2008, second quarter to be exact. And so he said, okay, how long will it take to develop the software? And I said, well, we have to do more than just put the optical character recognition and text-to-speech synthesis and compress that into the platform size of a mobile phone. We also need a new layer of software because as a blind person holds a device, there's going to be 3 different levels of rotation and tilt that we have to correct for. There'll be curved images. There's uneven illumination. You don't have to control the illumination of a scanner. There's poor quality optics. I mentioned 8 vagaries of images captured with a portable device. And we said, okay, I understand. How long will that take? And I said, 6 years. So he said, okay, let's get started. So we started in 2002, right on schedule, spring of 2008. Phones powerful enough to actually support this application became available, although we had been working on it already for 6 years. A little bit to my surprise, the software got done on time, and we introduced this product. There are now thousands of blind people and dyslexic individuals going around snapping pictures of signs on walls and handouts at meetings like this when reading the print as they go through the day. And there are other companies now that have noticed, hey, cell phones can do this. They're starting to develop it, but they'll miss the window of opportunity. So that's really important for any kind of project. I don't think I need to give that advice to this group, but it's really important to anticipate where technology will be and plan your project for the world that will exist when you finish the project, not the world that will exist when you start the project. So I'll give you a little demonstration of this. This is a lot more powerful than the reading machine I showed you. You'd read 16 different languages.
Hello, I'm the K-Reader
It
Mobile.
can translate from one language to another. We just, actually a few days ago, won the first prize from Nokia for the best Nokia application of technology for their phones.
Settings loaded.
And we're talking to them about doing this for travelers.
Viewfinder on. Ready to shoot. Taking picture.
So I'll read a passage from my book relevant to today's conference.
Pre-processing picture in books, articles, and labels format. Camera is 0 degrees clockwise
We'll
relative
rotate
to the
the
page.
image any amount.
Text cut
And we'll
off on
correct for
bottom.
other vagaries like tilt, uneven illumination, curved images.
GNR 227 atom by atom. We are shrinking the key feature size of technology in accordance NDTH, the law of accelerating returns, at the exponential rate of approximately a factor of 4 per linear dimension per decade. Canceling. Please wait. Processing canceled. Ready to shoot.
I'll read you a document now in Spanish. I'll
Settings loaded.
tell it that it's
Ready
a
to
Spanish
shoot.
document.
Taking picture. Pre-processing picture in books, articles, and labels format. Camera is 0 degrees clockwise relative to the page.
I'm pretty good at taking the image, but you can rotate it any amount.
Singularidad tecnológica de Wikipedia, la enciclopedia libre. En futurología, la singularidad tecnológica, algunas veces llamada simplemente la singularidad, es...
Okay, so I'll ask it to translate. And tell it we want to translate into English.
Translation on. Technological singularity from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. In futurology, the technological singularity, sometimes called simply the singularity, is a future event in which it is predicted that technological progress and societal change accelerate due to the development of superhuman intelligence.
So
Canceling, please wait.
that's it.
Processing canceled. Viewfinder.
So it's not quite blood cell size yet. But as I said, what used to fit in the building now fits in a cell phone in your pocket. And what fits in your pocket will fit in a blood cell based on my projections in 25 years and will be a lot more powerful. So let me show you just how pervasive this exponential growth is, how predictable it is. These graphs have just been updated for the last 5 years. And I've not taken into consideration the fantastic progress we've seen this morning. But so far, things are right on track. The pace of technological change is accelerating due to this exponential growth of information technology. These are, by the way, logarithmic graphs. Straight line on a logarithmic graph is exponential growth. Each level is 10 or 100 times greater than the level below it. The telephone took 50 years to be adopted by a quarter of the US population. Cell phone did that in 7 years. These early technologies, telephone, radio, television, took decades to be adopted. These later, more decentralized, self-organizing technologies like the internet, mobile phone, took only a few years to evolve. I mean, think how different things were just a decade ago. Most people didn't use search engines. That sounds like ancient history. Imagine life without search engines. Wikis are brand new. Social networks, blogs were not used principally 5 years ago. So the world changes at an accelerating pace. And I have a whole theory on biological and technological evolution as to why this is the case. Someone asked me before lunch, what is the laws of physics that underlie the law of accelerating returns and our technological progress? And there is a physical law, which is we live in a universe that allows the embodiment of information in atomic structures. And that led to evolution, to those atomic structures forming more and more complex molecules that can embody information, and finally evolved DNA. And then DNA led to species that could actually embody information in their brains, and finally led to a species that could embody information in its creations, in its tools, and its technology. And the reason that an evolutionary process accelerates is it creates a capability, it evolves a capability, and then it adopts that capability as part of its methods of evolution. So the next stage goes more quickly. This is a double logarithmic graph. On the x-axis, it's how many years ago this paradigm shift took place. On the y-axis, it's how long it took for that paradigm shift to evolve and be adopted. So the very first paradigm shift, life, biology, basically DNA, an information-carrying molecule, took 1 billion years to evolve. But then biological evolution adopted it. It's used it ever since. The next stage, the Cambrian explosion, when all the body plans of the animals evolved, went 100 times faster, only took 10 million years. Biological evolution kept accelerating. Homo sapiens, there actually were a few species and subspecies that could develop tools. We're the only surviving one, but that only took a few 100,000 years, really a blink of an eye in biological evolutionary terms. And then adopting Homo sapiens and a technology-creating species as the cutting edge of evolutionary development, the first stage of tool creation was a little bit faster, tens of thousands of years for fire, stone tools, the wheel. And then we always use the latest technology, the latest tools, to create the next tools. And so that technology has accelerated. The printing press took a century to be adopted, half a millennium ago. The first computers were designed pen on paper and actually wired with screwdrivers and took years to develop. Now we use computers to design computers, and 10th generation computer-assisted design software to do 12 different layers of design automatically. And so putting these paradigm shifts on this logarithmic graph, it forms a straight line showing this continual acceleration. If we put them on a linear graph, it looks like everything has just happened. That's the nature of exponential growth. But some people criticized this graph and said, well, Kurzweil only put points on the graph if they fit on the straight line. If I had a paradigm that didn't fit on the straight line, I just didn't bother to include it. So to address that, I took 15 different lists from different thinkers and reference works called Sagan's Cosmic Calendar, the American Museum of Natural History, Encyclopedia Britannica, a dozen other lists. And these lists were not trying to either make or break my point. This is just what they thought were the key events in biological and technological evolution. And there is some disagreement. Some people think the Cambrian explosion took 25 million years, not 10 million years. Some people include the ARPANET with the internet, so it's 25 years, not 10 years. A lot of disagreement when human language started, both spoken and written. So you see some spreading of the points. But there's a very clear trend line. There's no denying that there's an acceleration. Nobody thinks the internet took 1 million years. Nobody thinks the Cambrian explosion happened in 10 years. Not much happened in 1 million years, 1 billion years ago. So an evolutionary process inherently accelerates. And there's no discontinuity in an exponential, and we don't see a discontinuity, but we don't need to because the nature of exponential growth is explosive enough. It's smooth, but it ultimately is quite disruptive. And the exciting thing is that the field we're talking about here today, which is reverse engineering biology, and you can see that nanomedicine requires understanding biology because you can't extend it and build it and overcome its limitations without understanding what it is in the first place. That is now an information process. We can now understand biology in its true terms as an information process. I mean, that is what is going on. There's been an evolutionary process of bits of data in the genome. And we're understanding how that works. We're in an early stage of that, but it's going to accelerate. And if you look at the precision and the scale, for example, of biological simulators, you see the same phenomenon. Same phenomenon in modeling brain regions. And I'll come to that in a moment. And here I just illustrate on a linear scale the difference between an exponential and linear progression. They look the same early on because you're doubling tiny numbers initially, but ultimately they diverge quite radically. And they are made up of a cascade of S-curves of different technologies. And I mentioned Moore's law is just one example of many. So this is updated now, just recently, up to 2007. The version through 2002 is in Singularities Near, which I just read to you from. And it's really amazing how smooth a progression this is. Now, the degree of progress is hidden by a logarithmic scale because it's powers of 10. Actually, here it's powers of 10,000 between each level. So this represents trillions-fold improvement over the century, a billion-fold improvement just since I was an undergraduate. But what's even more amazing to me is look at how smooth and predictable a progression this is. And I say this now not just backfitting and overfitting to past data. I've been making these forward-looking predictions based on these progressions for 30 years. And this is a measure of the innovation of millions of people. And it's amazing how predictable it is. Now, Martine and I had a discussion before lunch that this kind of insight might lead to apathy. People feel, well, progress is inevitable anyway. Why bother, extending ourselves and working on solving problems? What's inevitable is the power of these technologies, barring some catastrophic meltdown of civilization, which is not impossible. There's still some 20,000 thermonuclear weapons, and they don't get much attention, but they're still there, and they're still on a hair trigger. But I'm optimistic about that. But I'm not necessarily sanguine about the potential for destruction. We didn't have a catastrophic meltdown of civilization in the 20th century, but we did have 180 million people die in the wars of the 20th century. Technology is inherently a double-edged sword. Ever since stone tools and fire, they've been deployed for overcoming our suffering and for creative expression on the one hand, and being destructive on the other. And the same technologies we're talking about here can be deployed to overcoming cancer, or they could be deployed by a bioterrorist to reprogram a biological virus to be more deadly, more communicable, or more stealthy. I've actually been working with the Army on setting up a rapid response system for that. And the whole other area of United Therapeutics and its virology technology is a brilliant, broad spectrum potential treatment for arbitrary destructive biological viruses, and we just had some communication with the Department of Defense, and they're quite interested. So how we apply them, whether we just sit back and allow a bioterrorist to be destructive and don't put that rapid response system in place, or whether we do protect ourselves and protect civilization and deploy them aggressively to overcoming cancer and extending human longevity, health, prosperity, creativity, that's in our hands. That is not preordained. How we apply these technologies is very much what we should be working on. And so that's really a reason not to be complacent. But it is really amazing to me how predictable, through 5 different paradigms, this progression has been. There were shrinking vacuum tubes in the 1950s. CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower in 1952, the first time the networks did that. And then every year they made the vacuum tubes smaller and smaller to keep this exponential growth going. That then hit a wall. They couldn't shrink the vacuum tubes anymore and keep the vacuum. And that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. It was not the end of the exponential growth of computing. We then went to another paradigm, transistors, and then integrated circuits. Supercomputers marching along. And I don't want to dwell on these examples of electronics, but I am fond of this graph. This has just been updated to 2007. So when I was a high school student, I bought something actually about 4 times the size of this for $50. I could switch 1 bit, telephone relay with support circuitry. 1968, I could buy a whole transistor for just $1 that could do the same thing, and it was a lot smaller and easier to use. You can buy 500 million of them now for $1. And okay, you've heard these fantastic comparisons, but again, look at how amazingly predictable this progression is. This is not a government-mandated program. Well, if it were, it probably wouldn't look like this anyway. It's not some physics experiment on a tabletop. This is, again, the measure of millions of people's innovation. And as we made them cheaper, they're better because they're smaller, they run faster. The cost of a transistor cycle has come down by half about every year. What does that mean? That means 50% deflation in electronics. So you see that all the time. I mean, Apple comes out with an iPod that's twice as good for half the price. And it's not because Apple is so brilliant. They are brilliant at design. But that's true of all of electronics. And it's not just electronics. It's true of genetic sequencing data. The first genome cost $1 billion. NIH is now collecting 1 million genomes for $1 billion. It's true of brain data. It's true of bits being moved around on the internet and nodes on the internet. And every example, and now it's true of health and medicine in terms of all of the different aspects of the technologies you're talking about. How many respirosites we can build for $1 billion or $1. And all of these aspects are growing exponentially, and they have a 50% deflation rate. Now you can say, okay, information technology is this funny little portion of the economy that follows this strange curve, but it doesn't really affect the overall numbers. Well, actually, more and more of the economy is becoming an information technology. I mean, health and medicine, it's in an early stage, so it hasn't taken over all of it, but the cutting edge of it, and ultimately all of health and medicine, is becoming an information technology. That's $2 trillion a year just in this country. It's maybe 20% of our GDP. With the rest of the GDP collapsing, it's going to be, who knows. But more and more industries are becoming information technologies. Just a few years ago, if I wanted to send you a movie or a sound recording or a book, I would send you a FedEx package. Now I can send you an email attachment. And in the future, when we have desktop nanofactories that can produce a wide range of physical products from an information file by reassembling molecular fragments using massively parallel computation-controlled processes, I'll be able to email you a wide range of physical products as an information file, and you'll use inexpensive input materials to turn them into products like solar panels, like modules to build housing, like clothing, and so on. And ultimately, everything will become information technology. And economists worry about deflation, depending on what week of the year it is, they actually seem to be back on deflation. We had massive deflation during the Depression. That was because of a collapse of demand. We're seeing a collapse of demand again, but this deflation is from an increase in productivity and an increase in price performance. That's presumably a good thing, but some economists will say, well, if most of the economy is influenced by information technology and you get twice as much of it each year for the same cost, people aren't going to double their consumption year after year. Sure, if it's cheaper, you'll buy more, but you're not going to actually buy twice as much and keep up with that 50% deflation. So the size of the economy as measured in constant currency will shrink, and for a variety of actually good reasons, that would not be a good thing. But that's not what we see. We actually do double, we more than double our consumption of every form of information technology. In fact, every form of information technology has increased by 18% per year in constant dollars, despite the fact you get twice as much of it per dollar every year, and that's been true for the last half a century. And the reason for that is as price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications explode on the landscape. I mean, people didn't buy iPods 15 years ago when they would have cost $10,000 each. So when that became cost effective, that exploded on the landscape. And people aren't going to buy respiratory sites at a quadrillion dollars a piece or even a quadrillion dollars per body. But when they cost $1,000 per body, that will explode on the landscape. I just put up magnetic data storage just because that's not Moore's law. It's not shrinking transistors on integrated circuits. It's shrinking magnetic spots on the substrate. Different engineers, different companies, different countries, same progression. This really is a phenomena that exists for any type of information technology. And the one that's really exciting to everyone personally is this biotechnology revolution and the nanotechnology revolution that will be built on it as we understand biology and how to extend it. And there really isn't a clear distinction, because as we see problems with biology, we can fix them either by reprogramming our DNA or changing proteins or going beyond biology and adding structures that don't exist in biology. And we can learn a lot about how to do that by learning how biology works and how biology creates motility, for example, and stores energy, and use those secrets, but then go beyond them. And that's what engineering does. It takes subtle scientific insights and magnifies them, like the rays of the sun. I mean, consider Bernoulli's principle. It's a very subtle, very weak scientific principle that the air pressure is slightly different over a moving curved surface compared to a flat surface. Interesting, and they're still arguing why that is. But it's an interesting, subtle scientific insight. Well, engineering took that and created the whole world of aviation. So as we learn the secrets of biology, how it can provide energy and mobility, destroy pathogens, we can amplify them a millionfold and really overcome the limitations of biology. And DNA sequencing costs basically come down by around half. It's actually picked up speed recently. Every year it was $10 per base pair in 1990. It's a small fraction of a penny today. The amount of genetic data has approximately doubled every year. This continued past the end of the Genome Project, and now there are other projects like the Proteome Project to understand how the genome expresses itself in proteins and how the proteins interact with each other. And there has been a breakthrough recently in simulating protein folding, which is the key to biology. Communications technology, another example. This is updated to 2007. There were bits being moved around on the internet, doubling about every year. And this is a deeply democratizing technology. I wrote in the 1980s in my first book that the Soviet Union was doomed because if they provided their professionals with these workstations that were far more powerful than the copiers they were banning, they would destroy totalitarian control of information. If they didn't provide them, they would destroy their economy. I actually felt they would do a little bit of both, and that both would do them in. And that is what we saw in that coup against Gorbachev in '91, which marked the end of the Soviet Union. The photo op was Yeltsin bravely standing on a tank, but the tanks had nothing to do with it. It was a clandestine network of decentralized communication with early fax machines, early email on teletype machines, over phone lines that kept everybody in the know, and the paradigm of grabbing the central radio and TV station and keeping everybody in the dark didn't work anymore. And we saw a great wave of democratization during the 90s, really fueled by the rise of the World Wide Web. And these tools are also democratizing in terms of the tools of creative expression and disruptive technology, including in the biological field. But a kid in her dorm room now can create a full-length motion picture with high definition for using a $500 camera and her personal computer. And these tools are really in everybody's hands. I just got back from China. Half the farmers in China have devices in their pocket. They're called cell phones, but they're actually very powerful computers and communication devices. They can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes. And they are actually creating a lot of disruptive technology. They've got very influential blogs. There's 100 million blogs in China. And this is the farmers of China. In Africa, cell phones are ubiquitous. And there are efforts now to create high-quality diagnostic and therapeutic recommendation systems using the increasingly ubiquitous communicators that everybody is carrying around. A couple of kids at Stanford wrote a little software as a dorm project, just a little experiment for fun, on their $1,000 laptops, and created a company that's worth $100 billion today, even in today's economy, and you probably use it to search the web. So the tools of disruptive change are really in everybody's hands. You don't have to be a government agency or a large university or corporation in order to create these kinds of disruptive changes. And okay, this graph here, I had a little bit of this graph in the 1980s, first few points, and projected that we would see a World Wide Web emerging in the mid-1990s. If you look at the same graph on a linear scale, it looks like this. So to the casual observer, it looks like the World Wide Web came out of nowhere in the mid-1990s, but you could see it coming if you look at the exponential progression. And if we look now at the exponential progression, we can see a lot of disruptive change, particularly in this field of biology, now that it's in information technology. And we're shrinking technology, according to my models, a factor of 100 per 3D volume per decade. And the progress we've seen in these conferences is really ahead of that curve. These are actually illustrations from Eric Drexler's book that Martine mentioned that have been animated and also have been simulated. And this is the RESPR site that you saw. And I've been talking with Rob Freitas about this for many years. It's exciting to see actual practical progress being made on this, and that we can get on exponential progressions where we can see really the end of the road for deploying these. And as was mentioned, this is a fairly simple device because it doesn't require computation. It just requires delivering oxygen and carbon dioxide. But if you look at the progressions of what we can do now and apply them, we'll be able to put quite a bit of computation in 25 years in a blood cell size device. And we're showing that blood cell devices can perform therapeutic functions. That's already been demonstrated in animals. The whole issue of biocompatibility has been addressed in great detail. Not to say that we can just cross that off our list of concerns, but we have shown that it is feasible. In fact, Rob Freitas has written a whole book on biocompatibility, and that is a manageable issue. Power is a big issue, will continue to be. A lot of biology is based on that, but that's turning out to be a tractable issue too, particularly when we understand how biology deals with that issue. One of the more advanced projects or designs that Rob Freitas has conceived of is a robotic white blood cell, which does have computation and can be programmed and download software from the internet to combat specific pathogens, so can be used for pathogens that it hasn't seen yet. And you know, if you think about what a white blood cell does, it's very clever, very intelligent, but it's actually very sluggish. I've watched one of my own white blood cells in a microscope, and it was quite clever. It actually blocked the escape route of a bacteria on the slide, and then kind of went around it and finally cornered it and devoured it, but it didn't do it that quickly. It took an hour, and it was a very boring thing to watch. So these devices can do that much more quickly, ultimately in seconds. They can be much more flexible. We can understand the limitations of our immune system in terms of autoimmune disorders and reprogram these devices around that. We'll have plenty of computation in the 21st century to do things like simulate the human brain. Key issue then is where will we get the software? The history of artificial intelligence is that most of the software has not come by understanding the human brain. And there have, in fact, been skeptics that we would ever learn anything from the human brain that would be of value in artificial intelligence. And I've had this long-standing argument with Tommaso Poggio, who's now head of the McGovern Brain Center at MIT. He was head of the Vision Lab for many years. And he said, we're not really learning much from the human brain that informs us and our machine vision projects. And I said, well, that's because you haven't modeled human vision yet. When you do, you'll learn something that will be of value. And that we learned a lot on speech recognition, which is another area of technology I've been involved in, when we got these early transformations, which were very non-intuitive, about how the human brain processes auditory information. And he was skeptical. Well, when I saw him 2 years ago at AI 50, which was the 50th anniversary of the 1956 conference at Dartmouth that gave artificial intelligence its name, he said, you know, Ray, you were right. We've just have this great new model and simulation of the human visual system, and it was very non-intuitive. We applied those insights to our machine vision projects, and we got a big boost in performance. And that's one of the areas that we have now modeled and simulated, at least to some degree of specificity. And we're making exponential progress. The spatial resolution of brain scanning is doubling every year. The amount of data we're gathering is doubling every year. And we are making very rapid progress in modeling and simulating different regions. This is a block diagram of 15 regions of the auditory cortex that are modeled, simulated, and tested. There have been psychoacoustic tests applied to the model and simulation. Get similar results applying those same tests to human auditory perception. Same thing for visual system that I just mentioned. Cerebellum has been modeled and simulated. This is an important region. It comprises more than half the neurons in the brain. It's where we do our skill formation, like catching a fly ball. I mean, how does a 10-year-old kid do that? I mean, what she sees is the ball going up in the air, and she knows to move her hand like this. Well, there's about a dozen simultaneous differential equations that have to be solved to make that connection. And last time I checked, most 10-year-olds haven't taken calculus. So how do they do that? Well, we actually understand now that cerebellum does solve those dozen simultaneous differential equations. It has to be trained in order to gain the parameters to solve the equations. That's why you have to practice the skill, and this has been modeled and simulated and tested. There are simulations of growing complexity of slices of the cerebral cortex. That's arguably the most important region. That's where we do this sort of magical thing that humans do of hierarchical thinking, where you can take a complex set of ideas or symbols and make one symbol out of it and then use that in another hierarchy. All of language is based on hierarchical thinking. And no other species does that as well. Chimpanzees do it a little, but they really are not over that threshold to create complex language structures like human beings. The sentences that they use in these experiments are fairly simple. That's done in the cerebral cortex, and we have simulations now that can begin to do that. So these simulations are scaling up exponentially. And, well, some people say, okay, the progress is exponential, but the goal is so far out that it'll still take centuries to get there because there's this vast complexity of the human brain. But the complexity is actually more than it appears. If I were to hand you the cerebellum and say, here, reverse engineer this for me, and you'd look at it and go, there's trillions, literally, of connections, and they're incredibly convoluted, and I'm never going to be able to figure this out. Well, we have figured it out. It's actually not that complicated. There's only a few genes that control it. There's only a few tens of thousands of bytes of information in those genes. And there's massive redundancy with a certain amount of stochastic process. So the genome says the following about the cerebellum. It says organize 4 neurons like this, and now repeats 10 billion times, add a little bit of random variation with each repetition within the following constraints. And that's what the genome says in summary about the cerebellum. And we have figured it out, and we have modeled and simulated it. The brain is a probabilistic fractal, And here's another fractal that you've seen. It's the Mandelbrot set. And this is it's a very complicated image, and there's some actually cool animations where you can zoom in on the Mandelbrot set, and it gets more and more complex, and there's never changing or always changing complexity within complexity. There's billions of bytes of information depending on the resolution that you display it with. It's on the cover of a book called Complexity. But the design of the Mandelbrot set is 6 letters long. The formula of the Mandelbrot set is 6 characters. And it's repeated iteratively, and you get these very complex structures. And if you add a little bit of randomness with each repetition, you get even more complex structures. And that's what the brain is. It's a probabilistic fractal. The amount of design information I show in Singularity is Near, it's about 25 to 50 million bytes, probably 25 million bytes. There's only 800 million bytes in the whole genome, but it's replete with redundancies. One sequence called ALU is repeated 300,000 times and comprises 3 or 4% of the genome, and there's other massive redundancies. And if you have redundancies, you can use lossless compression and reduce the amount of information. So the whole genome can be reduced to 50 million bytes, of which perhaps half describes the design of the brain. But it is implemented in a massively redundant, stochastic, probabilistic fashion. Now, that's not to say it's simple. 25 million bytes of this complexity with a great deal of three-dimensional interaction is complicated, but it's a level of complexity that we can manage, and we are managing. And I make the case in Singularity is Near that we will have these models well within 20 years, in time for me to win my bet with Mitch Caper that an AI will pass the Turing test by 2029. And so I don't want to dwell on this, but actually it is on people's minds. The GDP has been growing exponentially. You can see little ripples from recessions. The Great Depression, you can see, is a little bump down and then recovered with World War II. Hopefully we'll find a different solution to this one. But it's interesting that every recession, including the Great Depression, this curve snapped back to where it would have been had that not occurred in the first place. And what's driving this is labor productivity has gone from $30 to $130 in 45 years in constant dollars from the impact of information technology. And the application of these technologies is exponential. Here's e-commerce, now $2 trillion. And you might say, oh, wait a second, wasn't there a boom and a bust in these dot-coms? How come we don't see that on here? That was a Wall Street phenomena, which we know it's not that sanguine. Not a Main Street phenomena. Wall Street looked at the internet and said, wow, this is going to change everything. This is going to turn every business model on its head. So all the values soared. But they didn't have a real model of how long that would take. And if you remember my genome curve and my internet curve, it took a decade till these, even though exponential progressions, actually got traction. So Wall Street came back 3 years later, around the year 2000, and said, gee, it hasn't changed everything. It hasn't changed anything. I guess we were wrong, and all the values went the other way. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, it was growing at an exponential pace, and you now have dot-coms like Google and other companies like that that are, in fact, doing quite well with $10 billion of revenue. And this has been a smooth exponential progression, and that will be true of biotechnology and nanomedicine. Right now, they're small phenomena in an economic sense, but as they get traction, they will be multi-trillion-dollar phenomena. And IT's share of the economy is growing exponentially. It will be most of the economy by the 2020s. Intellectual property is driving this, and that's growing exponentially. Education is growing, if you look at the macro scale, because we are destroying jobs at the bottom of the skill ladder, adding new jobs at the top of the skill ladder. So the skill ladder is moving up, and we are investing more in education. We are spending 10 times as much as we did 100 years ago in constant dollars per capita on K through 12 education. We had 60,000 college students in 1870. We have 6 million today. Solar energy. I was asked to do a project on energy by the National Academy of Engineering, and Larry Page and I took up the energy portfolio and wrote the report on that. And we looked at different energy technologies and came up with solar energy as having really the potential to transform energy because it is growing exponentially. It has been doubling every 2 years for the last 20 years. And right now, it's at about 0.5% of all the world's energy. And it's very easy to dismiss technologies when they're 1% or less than 1%, just like the Genome Project was dismissed when it was 1% of the genome, and the internet was dismissed when it was 1% of potential users. And solar energy is dismissed because it's 0.5%, but it's doubling exponentially. It's only 8 doublings away from meeting 100% of our energy needs, and we are applying now nanotechnology, which is a form of information technology, to reorganizing matter and energy at the molecular level to provide new materials and new devices. And there's really developments every few weeks on some new ideas and new deployments. And this is actually the relevant curve. There's very smooth exponential growth, doubling every 2 years. And the cost has been coming down rapidly, which is driving this. So we believe within 20 years, we can meet all of our energy needs through solar. And again, energy storage is a key issue because of the intermittency of solar, but we're making progress in that as well with nanotechnology. I'm involved with one company that applies MEMS to microscopic sized fuel cells. There are many ideas on how to do that. So I'll show you just one other example of technology we put together. We have a prototype of a phone like this that does translation, but rather from printed documents, it goes from spoken speech. And I've used this to talk to people, and we're actually talking also to Nokia about this. We actually took the current version of the speech recognition that I pioneered in the 1980s and the current version of the speech synthesis that my company pioneered in the 1970s, added language translation, and created this translating telephone.
This is a demonstration, comma.
Dies ist eine Demonstration
Of a prototype of a quote translating end quote telephone. Period.
von einem Prototyp eines übersetzenden Telefons.
Within a few years, comma,
Innerhalb einiger Jahre
we will be able to talk to anyone, comma,
wir werden fähig sein, zu jemandem zu reden,
regardless of their language. Period.
ohne Rücksicht auf ihre Sprache.
The rain in Spain, comma,
La pluie en Espagne.
stays mainly in the plain. Period.
Reste dans la plaine principalement.
Merci pour votre attention. Period.
Thank you for your attention.
Well, pardon my French. So computers are getting smaller and smaller. They're in our pockets. They'll make their way into our belt buckles and clothing. We'll solve the problem of displays. People like large displays and spend thousands of dollars. Actually, now it's hundreds of dollars on large high-definition displays, but they also like to watch movies on devices this size. We'll put them in our eyeglasses. There are already prototypes of devices like this that can beam images to your retina. The image can stay constant as you move your head by measuring your head movement. It can also take over your whole visual field of view. There's a very impressive prototype of that at Stanford. So you can enter a full immersion virtual reality environment. The most exciting application of this is augmented reality. So as you look at someone, you'll get pop-ups telling you it's their birthday next Tuesday, remind you what their name is. I would find that helpful. Effective language translation. As we get to 2029, I envision that we will have reverse engineered the human brain. We'll have computers operating at human levels. By the way, we have that already for specific tasks. I mean, I could list 100 tasks that are deeply integrated in our economic infrastructure today. Every time you send an email, intelligent algorithms route the information. Same for cell phone calls. You get an electrocardiogram, it comes back with an intelligent automatic analysis from the computer that arrives out of doctors. Same for blood cell images. Intelligent algorithms help design products, help control just-in-time inventory levels, assemble products in robotic factories, help fly and land airplanes, guide intelligent weapon systems, automatically detect credit card fraud, and I could go on. And these are tasks that used to be done by human intelligence are now done by machine intelligence just as well or better at very low cost. By 2029, we really will have systems that can replicate the full range of human intelligence, but it's not going to be an intelligent invasion of machines to displace us. This is not an invasion from Mars. We've always used our tools to extend and expand who we are. It's the nature of being human. And we're going to do that with these devices. Nanobots, and it's actually a pleasure to speak at a conference where nanobots are talked about seriously, will be a very powerful, common application. And people say, well, what if I don't want to use them? Well, there's always going to be early adopters and late adopters. There's going to be conservative, well-tested applications. Very few people will opt out of using respiratory sites if it really can protect them from a heart attack and lead to better oxygenation. I was actually interviewed by ESPN saying, well, we're going to ban these in athletic contests, right? and I said, well, we should ban steroids because they're bad for your health, and if you don't ban them, you're forcing athletes to do something that's bad for their health, and that happens anyway. But if we ban these, we'll be forcing athletes to not do something that's good for their health. And if you do that, you'll have the specter of high school students in their gymnasiums routinely outperforming the Olympic athletes. But we will be expanding ourselves. These nanobots can go into our brains through the capillaries, interact with our biological neurons, put our brains on the internet, provide direct brain-to-brain communication. I mean, it's a convenient place to put it. I mean, right now it's in your pocket, so I can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes. It may as well be in my brain. Sometimes I leave my cell phone at home. It's a convenient place to keep it. And we will become a hybrid of biological and non-biological intelligence. And there are people, as I mentioned today, who have computers in their brain who can reprogram them from outside their bodies. Today that require surgery, but ultimately we'll send them in through the capillaries. And this will provide full immersion virtual reality from within the nervous system, but most of all, it'll provide an expansion of human intelligence, which is exactly what we've done already. Very little serious work, if any, can be done today without the expansion of our intelligence and knowledge and access to knowledge that computation and our tools provide us. And this is the progress we've made just through the linear progression of health and medicine. It's been formidable, but it's not an accurate guide to what we will see in the future now that health and medicine has become an information technology. And according to my models, which is slightly more optimistic than Aubrey de Grey's, we'll be adding more than a year every year to your remaining life expectancy about 15 years from now. And so people sometimes ask, well, when all these things you talk about come to pass, how long will human life expectancy be? And it's not a fixed number, because it's not like nothing else is going to happen from that point. If you can get to a certain point in good health, you'll be at a later point in time where there will be more technology. We'll get to a point where, and Aubrey calls it longevity escape velocity, I call it a tipping point in longevity, where the developments will be coming so rapidly, they'll be adding more time than is going by. Now, it's not a guarantee, because life expectancy is a statistical phenomenon. You can get hit by lightning tomorrow. We'll eventually have protections against that, but there are things that can happen. So it's not a guarantee, but we'll change the metaphor from the sands of time running out to them running in. And I'll just show you one quick other issue. Bill Joy wrote a famous cover story in Wired magazine, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. And so he's been considered the pessimist, and Ray Kurzweil is the optimist, and we've been put on panels together with that expectation. But he did get his, quote, pessimistic ideas, or ideas of concern from my book, Age of Spiritual Machines. And we do agree that these technologies are potentially dangerous. And there is, in fact, a relinquishment movement. In the movie that Martine and I are working on, Bill McKibben is in the movie and articulates why we should not pursue all the things that we're talking about here today, because they're too dangerous. And relinquishment would be a bad idea, in my view, because it would deprive us of these profound benefits that we're looking forward to, and there's still a lot of suffering in the world to overcome. It would require a totalitarian government to implement. And thirdly, it wouldn't work. It would just drive these technologies underground, where they, in fact, would be more dangerous. And the responsible scientists that are empowered to create the defenses, like a rapid response system for biological viruses, would be deprived of the tools to do that. And that is really the right answer. And this is an op-ed article that argues for developing that rapid response system and also argues for some ethical standards, like, for example, not posting on the web the full genome of the 1918 flu virus, because that's a recipe for destruction. And it's potentially more dangerous than the design of an atomic bomb, and no one would argue we should put that on the web. But in my view, and that's exactly why we should not be complacent, because we have increasing power in our hands, and we need to deploy that to overcome suffering and expand human liberty and expand human creativity. And these are tools that are democratized in terms of their creative potential, while we keep humanity safe from those who would abuse it. Thank you very much.